start to see the structure a little bit better there. When it comes to creating gins on a tree like this, it depends on the species. If we're talking about pines and, let's say, spruce or firs, for example, I kind of lump those together in terms of how the deadwood looks. It's all quite similar, whereas junipers look very different. So when it comes to pines and spruce and fir, I like to leave some of the old bark on the deadwood features rather than stripping 100% of it off. It just looks more natural to me. So what that means is, a branch like this down below here, what I'm going to do is take either concave cutters like this or flat splitters like this, depending on the scenario and the angle that I'm working with here. But basically I'll take these, I'll bite maybe a quarter of the way through or halfway through the diameter of the branch and then twist and peel that growth off. And I want to see most of the striations from the front side of the deadwood branch that I'm creating. And then at the base of the branch and along the back side of the branch, I'll leave quite a bit more old bark. That bark will weather off over time, but in the interim it looks very, very natural. And as it weathers off, you end up with more naturalistic striations underneath it as well. So some people will come through with like full-on scraping tools and scrape that stuff off. But then you're left with tool marks. It always looks man-made if we do that. So I'll show you what I mean here. I'm just going to bite and then start peeling. Now, as this wood dries out over the next, on pines it takes a while, say over the next probably 6 months or so, at some point I'll probably go back through, or whoever gets this tree, I would recommend that you go back through with a little mini blowtorch and char this deadwood as well, because it'll remove a lot of these fine little fibers here. And if you char it enough, you can create kind of an alligator skin texture that looks really naturalistic. That will weather off over time as well, but the patterns that are left underneath that charring will remain. Like you'll still have some of those sort of alligator skin texture underneath there, and it looks very cool. It's all personal. It's hard to say. I mean, as a general guideline, the thinner the branch, the shorter it should be. The thicker it is, the longer you can leave it. But it really depends on how it interplays with the foliage on the tree. Like for example, I cut this extra long here. I pruned probably another third of it off just by peeling it back. But this branch, I don't know if you can see it, it's got a little bit of curvature to it. So I want to leave some of that in there. I think that looks pretty cool. If I shorten it back too much, I'm going to have to make it really, really thin and really tapered to make it look good. So I want to leave a little bit of length to that. That being said, once I set the foliage in place, it may look weird on the tree. And it's going to look a little bit loud at the end of the demo today because it's bright yellow, because it's new wood. But as that weathers and grows out, I think it'll look better over time. So it all just depends. But can you guys see what I'm talking about here? Leaving some of that old bark around the backside here, down at the base, but really stripping away at the front there. I just think it looks much more realistic that way. And you don't always have to have the gin taper to a point at the end. As a matter of fact, most deadwood is going to break much more jagged. So we can go back through and peel the fibers back here at the end to give us some more realistic look on here. We may do that at the very end of the demo. I'm going to go ahead and peel this one away up at the top here, and then we'll talk a little bit about wire. But in the meantime, you guys have any other questions as we go here?
I'm a bonsai virgin, so I would like to know what kind of tree should I start with, if any, because I'd like to leave here with something to start.
Okay. It will depend a little bit on your home environment. Like I know a lot of people around here live in Chicago in apartments and high rises and stuff. So if that's the case, I would recommend getting some sort of tropical tree that you can keep indoors at your home. Or if you do have an outdoor balcony in those instances, as long as it's not overly windy, you can get a temperate climate tree. But indoor trees, I would say like a nice ficus is always a great thing to start with. If you want to deal with more outdoor trees, which I recommend, I think they're more fun to work with personally. If you have a setup where you keep the tree outdoors, I think Procumbens nana juniper is one of the best to work with. It's like the best sort of start and catch-all plant. Super easy to work with. You can clip and grow those trees and produce nice padded looks to them without having to wire them. They grow relatively slowly, but not so slowly that you lose interest in the tree. So you have to prune it probably a couple times a year, a couple times in the growing season. So if you want a deciduous tree, Japanese maples actually are really nice plants to work with. They're quite slow growing though, slow developing as bonsai. But that can be a nice thing if you don't want to constantly be pruning back a tree. If you want to prune it once or twice in the season and just kind of sit back and enjoy it, Japanese maples are quite nice to see. So certain species of trees will produce different looks to the deadwood. I mentioned the categories before, but even within just pines, for example, if you guys have ever dealt with limber pines, Pinus flexilis, a really cool species of pine, native to the United States. The crazy thing about limber pines is that they're the most brittle pines you'll ever work with, even though the name is Pinus flexilis. When the deadwood, or when the branches break on those trees, it breaks completely flat at the end. It looks like someone has gone through with loppers and lopped off all the branches, right? And that deadwood will weather naturally with that flat end. So when I'm working with a limber pine, I don't worry about trying to create this sort of tapered look to the deadwood. I like to embrace the natural sort of breaks in the wood. And you'll probably see some on display. I think there's a couple of limber pines here in the collection. Is that right, Chris? Is there a couple here?
There's one on the west side.
Okay, yeah. I would imagine if you look at some of the deadwood on there, there's going to be a few branches that have broken flat. That's just a natural way they break. Whereas ponderosas are incredibly flexible trees. They're like Gumby. And when you break the branches back, it's going to be a much more jagged, sort of fibrous look to the deadwood. So you can kind of adjust the look based on the species of tree. All right, so that's starting to look pretty good right through there. This is another feature over here. It's a little bit weird, but I kind of like this branch over here. We've already taken off so much foliage. We're going to keep this on here and embrace it. This we may build out as a secondary little tree with a secondary apex here. But this piece of deadwood is sticking up above it here. I'm going to go ahead and peel some of that back as well. And then we're going to talk wire on this plant.
Have you decided like on the angle? Like are you planning on having it?
Yeah, we're going to tip it up today. I'm going to try to set up these blocks. This is a pretty extreme angle change, so I don't know if I'm going to be able to get this to hold properly. So what I may end up doing is wiring it, and every once in a while as I set a branch, I'll lift it up, show you the angle, and at the very end I'll just stand here and you can take a proper angle. It's a bit precarious. When you're dealing with something like this, it's actually better probably to get a couple of big bags of soil that you can wedge up around the base of the tree and just kind of nestle the tree down into it. The wedges are a little easier to use if you're working with like a square pot, for example, or ceramic pot that the trees are planted in. But we'll make do today. All right, and with pines, I also recommend that you try to work with your hands underneath the branch as much as possible because the needles naturally go out and up. So if you're bringing your hand in over the top of the branch, inevitably you're going to bend some of the needles. Nothing will happen today as a result of that, but 2, 3, 4 weeks down the road, the tips of all the needles will start turning yellow. You have to go through and remove those. It looks really bad. It's bad for the health of the tree as well. So you want to try to work from the bottom if at all possible. Another thing I want to mention too is I did the needle plucking with all the old needles on the tree, but as I'm wiring the plant here, as we start setting the branches, I want all of the clusters of needles to sit in the same direction upright. So within a cluster of needles, inevitably you're going to have some that are going the wrong direction. And these are our new needles from this year. So I will pluck those needles out as I go. So for example, here, I don't know if you guys can see, it's curled downward. It's nitpicky, but if you do this across the whole tree and just pluck those guys out, you can take a tree like this that was wild at the start of the demo and create a very refined look to the plant.
Are you going to trim down the needles so they get smaller, or that will be something just for show?
Okay, so it depends on the species of pine you're working with as to whether or not it's an okay idea to actually physically cut the needles in half or cut them down to a shorter size. Ponderosa pines do not respond very well to having the needles cut. I don't recommend that you do it. It's not like it's going to kill the tree, but the tips will turn brown pretty significantly beyond the cut site, even if you use really sharp scissors and miss the tree afterwards. And not only that, but it looks like a haircut on the It looks really, really bad, in my opinion. So aesthetically, I don't recommend it. Really, the only species I would recommend doing a little bit of needle cutting would be black pines and maybe red pines, and that's basically it. And typically, we're only cutting the needles that are just slightly out of the profile of the branch. Because we can, like I said before, control the needle length to a large degree through decandling at the right time of year in the summer. But inevitably, you're going to have a few needles that get a little longer here and there. So, like for example, at the Japanese National Exhibition, the Kokufu in Japan, I guarantee you 100% of the black pines that go in that show have at least a handful of needles that have been cut back to an average length across the tree, just to sort of smooth out the look on the tree. But you will never see a tree that has had a full haircut across the plant.
And is that trimming negative to the judges? Or?
No, it's usually done right before the show starts, or at least right before the photography for the show starts. And as long as it's done in a way where it's just a few needles here and there, we're talking like less than probably 5 to 10% of the needles across the whole tree would have been cut. And if you do it right before the show, you're not going to see browning during the course of the exhibition. All right, so I've got one piece of 8 on there. We're going to go down to size 10 here for some of these smaller branches. And my goal when I'm wiring here in terms of cleanliness on the tree is to try to have only 1 or 2 wires at any given site on a branch. Right? Once you start getting 3 wires, 4 wires, 5 wires, it looks really, really messy. So I'm looking at trying to keep 1 or 2. 2 actually seems to look a little nicer, I think, than just a single wire. Right? So for example, here I'm going to double up through this section here. I'm following the pitch of the original wire.
Not 2 different gauges.
2 different gauges, yep. 2 different gauges here. All right, and weaving that wire in between the foliage here so we don't crush it. And then out at the end of the branch, we always want to loop the wire at the end of the branch because we're going to drop the branches down for the most part and then lift the tips up. So it gives us, we can create kind of pads that way, and it gives us a more vibrant look to the branches. By doing that, on a pine, when you get to the end of the branch where you've got the cluster of needles, if you take that last loop too far out on the end of the branch, you're going to end up crushing the needles together. If you loop it too far back, you don't have control over the branch tip. So you want to loop that wire right at the base where the needles come out of the branch. You don't want to go beyond it, right at the very base, and then you can lift and catch those needles. So it's this kind of a fine line there. I got too many needles, too many buds out here at the end, so we're going to reduce this back here.
You talk about fertilizer, NPK, you talked about no nitrogen at one point. Mm-hmm. Did you cut candles back or talk too much? What do you recommend in ratio?
What I recommend ratio?
NPK.
NPK, okay. So you have to identify what each of those things does for your trees. So if you guys have ever bought fertilizer, you see those 3 numbers that are listed on the side. Typically that's your NPK. So your nitrogen, your phosphorus, your potassium. So nitrogen, basically the function of nitrogen is to increase leaf size or needle size, increase internode length, essentially to put on tissue onto the plant and extend the growth of the plant. So the higher that value, typically the more growth you're going to get out of the plant in the single growing season. When it comes to phosphorus and potassium, I forget which is which, but one is going to be much more for flower production, fruit production on the tree, and also root production on the plant. And the other is what's considered kind of the quality element, which is the last one, so the potassium. So yeah, it's phosphorus that's good for root production and for flower production and root production on the tree. So let's say, for example, you've got a tree that's in early development, right? So one that you're trying to put on a lot of growth to. You're going to want to use a higher nitrogen fertilizer. So I typically use synthetics for trees that are in early development. So something like Osmoco Plus is a really good product, or Miracle Grow. Anything with a nitrogen value that's well above 10 is a 10 and 20, basically. It's going to put on a ton of growth. Once we start moving into that mid level of development, or slowing things down just a little bit, I usually switch over to organics at that point, and we'll use something like Grow Power, which I just heard today that they're going out of business this year. Yeah, which is surprising. But it's an organic fertilizer cake with a nitrogen value of around 10 to 12, somewhere around that range. You could use BioGold, you could use a number of different things, but getting that nitrogen value a little closer to 10 will slow things down a little bit. And then if you really want to slow things down, you can use very soft organics where the nitrogen value is like 5, 6, 7, something like that. So it depends on the goal and the stage of development with the tree. In addition to that, I recommend applying micronutrients to your trees. So these are going to be things like molybdenum, zinc, copper, iron. You can get basically all of those things out of liquid kelp and liquid fish. So if you start applying that on a pretty regular basis to your trees, meaning I typically do it about once every 10 to 12 days using a fertilizer injector system at my nursery. But we foliar feed and root drench with liquid fish and liquid kelp and a few other things mixed in there. But the combination of that plus a pretty well balanced NPK fertilizer is going to give you the best results for the most part. So for example, this tree, whoever wins this tree, I would recommend that you actually go ahead and start fertilizing it now because the growth is pretty much hardened off.